Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Ignite Your Curiosity Ahead of the IETF 119. My name is Stephanie Yun. I'm the General Manager of Licensing Framework Compliance at auDA. I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of this land on which this meeting is being held, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. I extend the respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in this virtual room today. I also wish to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's commitment to innovation and technology over many millennia, a commitment we, in auDA, the community as such, deeply respect and share. Before I introduce today's guest, I do want to highlight that this webinar is scheduled for 45 minutes and will be recorded. Without further delay, I'm delighted to introduce our special guest, representing the Internet Engineering Task Force, or the IETF. With a mission of making the Internet work better, the IETF is a premier standards development organisation for the Internet. The IETF helps shape the trajectory of the Internet by developing technical standards for its Internet users, network operations and equipment vendors. Really importantly, in March 2024, less than 6 months away from now, the IETF will gather in Brisbane for the IETF 119 or 119th meeting, attracting more than 1,000 technology leaders from around the world. So, to talk about the IETF and the IETF 119, I'm pleased to introduce Mark Nottingham. Mark has been a prominent figure in shaping the Internet over the past 25 years and has contributed extensively to the IETF throughout that period. I'm also pleased to introduce Bron Gondwana. Bron has been working as a programmer and developer for the last 20 years. In addition to his role as CEO of Fastmail, he co-chairs a number of IETF working groups and continues to apply his programming language skills in a range of developing projects. I know I'm certainly keen to learn more about the IETF and the upcoming conference, so I'm going to throw out some questions to our panelists. We will also have some time for questions at the end of the presentation. So if anyone is joining us online has any questions, please add them into the chat, and we'll do our best to fire them off to Mark and Bron before we wrap up. So, gentlemen, panelists, first question. How would you introduce the Internet Engineering Task Force for people who don't know anything about the organisation and what it does? I'm going to pass over to Bron first.
Yeah, I guess I would start by saying, checking, I guess, do they understand standards and what standards do, and introduce with some examples of how standards mean you can plug a power cable in and it works anywhere in the country. It plugs in. And in the same way, the IETF, when the internet started emerging, there were lots of different systems, and the IETF is the place where people coalesce to design standards so systems will interoperate with each other. So IETF's been around a long time. It celebrated 50 years not that long ago. So it's been developing standards that support communication between computers, and the IETF covers a lot of that. In terms of the way the IETF works, it brings people from all around the world, and it's a very flat organization. Everyone, no matter what their affiliation, comes in and has the same voice, can contribute to the development of standards and be involved in them. And on the other side, IETF standards are open to everyone in the world. So anyone is allowed to read them, anyone's allowed to implement them. It's fully open, both on the creating of standards and on the consuming of standards.
So very accessible.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mark, would you like to add anything in this description?
Sure. Yeah, I think Bron covered it pretty well at a high level. When I talk about this, I usually, say that on the internet, it's really computers talking to each other. My computer that I'm using right now has to talk to the Zoom server that we're using, which has to talk to your computer. When I browse the web, it has to talk to the web server. And the the discussion, the language between those computers needs to be standardized, as Bron was saying. This doesn't happen spontaneously. It doesn't happen just by companies agreeing pairwise, because there's so many different parties involved in the internet. There are open source projects, companies, everything from people who are producing routers to web browsers, everything in between. And so there needs to be a place where that happens. And the IETF is the predominant place where the internet is developed for those purposes. It's been going now for what, 30 years? Somewhere around there. No, more than that. A long time, let's say.
50 years.
Is it 50 now?
Yeah, we celebrated it a couple of years ago. 50 years.
Full disclosure, I've not been doing it that long.
Published.
Yeah. But Bron seems to remember something.
Mark has been doing it longer than I have. He was one of the first chairs that I went to see how running a working group is done. I was told if you want to see it done really well, go see one of Mark's groups. So
must have started when you guys were really, really young.
Yes. I guess the other thing, just to expand on one of Mark's points there, computers are very literal. You have to be quite precise or things don't work. So even more so than humans communicating to each other, we're speaking in some variant of English, and we can all use slightly different words and mostly understand each other's. Computers can't. If your standard's not really tightly specified, then they just don't communicate at all. So that's part of why standards bodies are really important, is that you can't just be close enough. You have to be really exact for computers to be able to talk to each other.
Perfect. And taking into account that it's been 50 years since you guys got established, so you're obviously doing something right. Okay, so the next question we have is, what topic currently is being worked on in the IETF do you find the most interesting? So in relation to your vast array of working groups that you have and all the topics out there, what would you find to be the most interesting topic to cover? I'm going to start with Mark first.
So personally, my technical interest is around HTTP and the web. I've been involved in the HTTP community in the IETF now for way too long. I've been chairing the working group since 2007, as Bron mentioned. And anything around HTTP, the protocol, HTTP caching is where my technical interests are. I think because I've been involved in the organization so long, and I think this has happened to Bron as well, you also get interested in the meta issues, so the administration of the organization and how we create RFCs, things like that, and that's interesting. And personally, for me, my more recent interests are around the interaction between standards bodies and regulators. As everyone has seen, there's a lot more interest in the internet and regulating the internet around the world. One can view standards bodies as a form of regulation themselves. We create the context which web and other internet applications operate within, and so that constrains them. And so the question is, how do we interact with legal regulators around the world, which is a big topic and one that's becoming more important. But there's lots more at the IETF. There's everything from transport protocols like TCP and more recently QUIC to routing to other application protocols like email and older protocols like Gopher and NNTP still get a mention once in a while. JSON formats, a lot of security protocols and formats. There's a lot of different areas one can be interested in. It depends on where you want to go. Personally, I stay at the kind of the upper technical layer, so around the web and application layer. I did help out with QUIC, which is down at the transport layer, and that was interesting and challenging for me, and I don't think I'll go down that far again, but we'll see.
I think it must be quite difficult to take into account the intersection between legal, regulators, standard, technical, and kind of meshing it all together. That can be quite complex because it's like Bron said, it's like people speaking different languages. So we kind of all have to get on a even pathway first before we can actually start working together. So I do I work with a lot of people with standards and in the legal field myself. So yes, I totally understand that. Bron, over to you. What would your most interesting topic be?
Yeah, I'm going to start with a little dig at Mark, who's been studying law. And as someone studying law, he should know that you should define your terms before you use them. RFC stands for Request for Comments. The IETF's main output is these documents, Request for Comments, which is a ridiculous name for a standard, but there you go. It seems to be what they've settled on. And these documents, we're nearly at 10,000 of them now. Each one of these goes through a very long, complex publishing process through what's called rough consensus, which means we pretty much agree that what's left are disagreements that have at least been aired and understood. You can't get total consensus because it's too easy for any one person to block things, but you need to justify the decisions, particularly need to justify that they will interoperate with all the material that the IETF has already published. And there's quite a process for handling errata as well. Again, if errors are found in the documents, we have a process for tracking that and making sure they get folded into the next version of them. So if you search RFC and then a number, almost always you will find an IETF document, and we will throw around RFC numbers when we're speaking. So I will say 3501 quite a lot, which is the IMAP 4 revision 1 email protocol specification. It's one of the ones that I have done a lot of work on. Email is my background. I run an email company, unsurprisingly. And in around about 2011, 2012, we wrote our own protocol for very fast synchronization between an email client running in a web browser and a server. And then we looked at it and we said, we should make this open to the rest of the world, and looked around for how to publish it. Spent quite a few years workshopping it around with the other companies who are doing email services before bringing it to the IETF, which I think was quite valuable for socializing it. And one thing that I think people don't necessarily understand about standards bodies, it's still a social process. You need to get support for your idea. You need to find people who are willing to implement it. If you want to standardize something and nobody else wants to use it, there's not much point standardizing it. So you need to get others who are interested in it. The IETF at least claims, partly there's politics as well, but claims to value running code and the rough consensus. So you get your rough consensus and you get examples, particularly if you can get multiple people building from the specification and interoperating with each other. That's at least some kind of clue that you've written something that works. So there is, and when I say values and politics, the IETF's pretty good about this. You want to show up with more than one person who wants to implement it. People will ask, and you want to show up having tested it. And quite frequently, the IETF will say, okay, that looks great. Can you go away, get some implementation experience before we publish this? Because we don't want to publish something that sounds good but doesn't work. So yeah, in about 2015, I started attending CalConnect, which is a calendaring conference that's not directly associated with the IETF, but there's a fair bit of crossover in the calendaring area. And also started working on this email stuff. And then in 2017, I came to the IETF with basically the Fastmail email protocol, but rewritten to be more generic. And then it came into the IETF process and we had tons of great feedback and made it a whole lot better. Started getting other implementers, and that was published in early 2020, the JMAP mail protocol. So I'm involved in that. I'm involved in the legacy email protocols, as we call them, which are all the ones everyone's actually using at the moment, maintenance of those, involved in calendaring, and have recently been involved in a date time working group as well. So it's all again, as Mark said, right at the top level. You have two people both from the art, applications and real-time section of IETF. This is only one of, I think, 8 different directorates within IETF. So we're kind of 1/8, depending how you count it. And there are hundreds of active working groups at the moment. And we represent just a few of those in the application space. So there is a lot of work. There are generally 8 separate tracks throughout the week of the IETF conference. And so it is hard. Every single session, I find at least one, often more than one thing I'd like to go and see. Particularly if I'm chairing one, I can't just nip into one of the others.
Yes.
So that's disappointing when I get a clash like that. But there's so much going on. So there's heaps to see at the IETF. You can also, the videos of everything are put up on YouTube afterwards, and they get sometimes in the 10s to 20s of views. It's not many people are watching the videos afterwards, but there are a lot of people who are there in the sessions. Transcripts are also available online. The minutes are available online. Agendas are all published in advance. So everything is public.
Okay, so we actually have a follow-up question on one of the comments you made, Bron. So it says here, I've observed and admired the IETF process for a very long time, but have never participated. I'm fascinated by the decision-making process, RFC 7282, that Bron referred to as a rough consensus and the use of consent regularly. Can either or both of you walk us through your experience of rough consensus, perhaps as a participant or a chairing a working group like that?
Yeah, 7282. That's a great reference. That's a RFC that Pete Resnick wrote a while back called on consensus and humming in the IETF. And if folks want to get one good answer to this question, that's a great place to start. The rough consensus process is a little bit it's hard to describe how it operates, and sometimes I think it's on a case-by-case basis. But generally, you're looking for a case where most of the room or most of the people participating are agreeing with the outcome, or at least not vehemently objecting to it. And you sometimes have a case where that agreement isn't reached, but you work through progressively, iteratively, until you find that, okay, well, there are these arguments versus these arguments, and these arguments are better technical arguments. And the chair is supposed to make their determination based on the technical arguments. Mm-hmm. And then what backstops that is if someone feels that there's a real injustice done, they can appeal that decision. They can take it to the next level. And there are actually multiple layers of appeals. And that gives kind of some structure to this decision-making process, where people feel that it's not just one person arbitrarily saying, oh, I choose you. But it can be very quick. It can be very drawn out. It depends on the nature of the group and especially the people who show up on a day-to-day basis. I personally find that building a cohesive group of people who can work together makes a huge difference. I've been in working groups where there's never been a physical meeting and it's been a bun fight. Everybody misunderstands everybody and goes against each other. That's not typical in the IETF, but it happens once in a while. I've been in groups where you have a really tight-knit group of 20 people from lots of different competing companies who can agree that it's more important to get this thing done than to compete with each other. And that's where I think the magic happens. I've also been in groups where we've made decisions by flipping a coin in the room, literally flipping a coin, because people in the room agree that it's more important to move forward than to have their solution be the one that wins, which I think is actually a really good sign.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's a great answer. Bron?
Yeah, it's interesting. Humming was something that you really have to experience to understand. I've been in a room with hundreds of people and had the chair ask for a hum, and it literally is just people humming. But the sound, I sing in choirs, and the sound of hundreds of people singing at once is amazing. A hum is that same uplifting experience. You really feel the energy in the room, and everyone's humming quietly enough you can't tell who is participating in the hum and who is not participating, but you can feel the weight of the room, and it does draw you together. You feel some commitment to the decision that was made because you were part of it. Having said that, humming doesn't make decisions. Humming gives the chair information. But if you say hum for option A, hum for option B, and there's a loud noise for option A and nothing for option B, then that's pretty clear that there's support. Often what there will be is a little bit of noise for option B, and then the chair will say, would one of the people who hummed for option B like to come to the microphone and state their case? And then you get to discuss the pros and cons there. But also they have an idea of the weight, and they might come up and say, I know I'm in the rough being the rough part of rough consensus, but here's this really important point that we haven't considered, and we need to discuss this. Maybe we need to test it before we can be sure that this is technically sound. And that's the kind of case where it's really important to allow that dissent, because without it, you can wind up with groupthink producing something that's really not as good. And the IETF values the quality over the speed. So things will certainly take time. The other thing that Mark mentioned about the multiple layers of checking, the chair will assess consensus within their group and declare consensus. But at that point, there's then someone who's called a document shepherd who has to write up a description of the document that's being passed through to be turned into an RFC. And it has to be then assessed by the directors of all the other areas to make sure that it's not conflicting with work that's happening in their area. And one of the things they will read is the shepherd's write-up, and they describe the path the document took. And if there was any roughness to the consensus within the working group, if they saw anything disagreement, that has to be documented and described to the other area directors to look at it and say, okay, this had some conflict, and yes, there's a possibility of an appeal, but we still think it should go through, or no, we think we're going to hold this, and anyone can block it going to the next stage. So it really is, there are a lot of checks and balances.
And just one little thing to add there, consensus is never declared in the room if you're in a meeting. The chair will say, I want to get a sense of the room. They want to get an idea of how people are thinking. Then they'll declare a tentative consensus on the mailing list. And what that will do is give people who weren't in the meeting the opportunity to give their input and say, no,
participate as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yes.
And so consensus is always declared on the mailing list. And then so usually the chair will say, okay, call for consensus. If it's a really important, decision, we don't, editorial changes, for example, don't get this, but they'll say, okay, we've decided on this path, call for consensus in the mailing list. And then they'll wait for couple of days, sometimes a week or two if it's a really big one, and say, okay, we've declared consensus if there's no pushback, or if the people who are pushing back have been declared to be in the rough.
Yeah, and there's also time for the people who were in the meeting to stop and think about it for a couple of days and come back and say, actually, on second thoughts, I've changed my mind.
Yeah. It sounds like a very fair process. So the next question is actually a two-parted question. So firstly, I'd like both of you to actually explain why have you participated in the IETF so long, but also I want to know what efforts are being made to ensure that there's a broad involvement in the working groups to get a very diverse view of it all. I'm going to pass over to Mark first.
So why I've done this for so long is a good question. I sometimes stay up late at night thinking about that. I think I work best as a long-term or a long-time horizon person. I like doing things that have impact on a large scale, but that takes a lot of time. And that seems to be a good match with standards work. If you come into this work and expect the world to change based on your ideas in weeks or months or even a small number of years, it's probably not for you, to be honest. It does take a long time to get that consensus, to have that discourse, and to write it down and get it approved and through all the different process steps, and then reflect it in the implementations that actually do what makes the internet happen. But when it does, you can really have significant impact, and I quite like that. So I think that's why I do it. I think the internet is important enough to kind of put that long-term effort into. In terms of making sure that we have diverse views, it's definitely a problem. If you go to an IETF meeting, you will notice a lot of guys. You will notice a lot of white guys. And there have been a lot of efforts over the years to include more communities, get more diversity among many different axes. We meet all over the world to try and share the pain of the travel that's inherent in it. Both Bron and I spend an inordinate amount of time on airplanes, which is unfortunate, but that's what you have to do.
We're also a significant fraction of the Australians who attend IETF.
True.
It is very, very US and a couple of other country centric.
US and European centric primarily. And sometimes you hear the Americans complain about having to go to other parts of the world, and you just have to beat them with a stick a little bit. But we're also, I wrote an RFC about this. We're trying to figure out how we can reach out to the rest of the world and to other organizations that are stakeholders in how the internet works, and incorporate their views. And that doesn't mean giving them control over the standards outcomes, but it does mean we need to open our eyes and look around and understand what the impact of our decisions are, so that at least we do that. We change how the internet works in an informed way. And that involves incorporating new viewpoints and perspectives. It's an ongoing challenge, and I think the biggest part of the challenge is that getting value out of the IETF, participating in the IETF is an incredibly time-consuming and expensive undertaking. It is a whirlwind, and if you go to the IETF meeting in Brisbane, you'll see there are 8, as Bron said, 8 different groups meeting at the same time, and that happens 5 times a day. And then there are meetings in the morning before the meetings, and meetings afterwards, and dinners to go to. And there's just this rush of information and relationships and discussions, and all the hallway discussions, which frankly is where most of the value is. And it's a lot to take in. And if you only go for a day, or you only stay on the mailing lists, you're not going to get the full value out of it, and you're not going to be as effective in the IETF as you could be. And so,
having said that, you can be pretty effective.
You can,
even on the mailing list. I've seen people
if you know what you're doing, yes, and if you have the relationships, but you need to build those relationships. You need to have that context, and getting those relationships and getting that context takes a lot of effort. Also, of course, you need to be highly technical, and that selects the people who can participate as well. And so these are the challenges, I think, to diversity and inclusion in the IETF, and there is a focus by leadership on that, especially over the last, I'd say, 5 to 7 years. And we are seeing some improvements, but by its nature, it's slow.
Yeah, and it's going to favor older people as well, partially because to get to the level of you are in a career where a company is willing to sponsor you to spend the amount of time that's required for IETF takes time, takes experience, and a lot of people who have been involved in the IETF continue to be involved in the IETF as they change jobs. Mark's nodding because he has done this. And often will continue to be at the IETF as they change employers, doing roughly the same thing, because the new employer hired them specifically for that capability. Also, we attend IETF as individuals. Even though we give our company affiliations, really the only place that matters is in selecting leadership. The nomination committee, as it's called, that selects the leadership group, has a rule that no more than 2 people from the same company are allowed to be on that committee to stop it being stacked, because obviously that is a danger for an organization like the IETF of being captured by a single company or a single group that would like to direct it in its own way. It's those challenges are very real. The other thing is that we don't pay people, and we can't force people to show up. So it is entirely who's interested, and you can make it easier for people to be involved. But in the end, it will be the people who want to be there are the people who will be there, and who will make the effort show up. It's a challenge to get people to review your drafts to the point that you trade favors to each other. I'll review yours if you review mine, type of thing. Because it's a lot of work. Reading and writing is a lot of work. Finding people to co-author with you is also a huge challenge. And as Mark said, the hallway track and the bar track is where some of the most important relationships building is done, and that is what's going to get you the trust of the people to take your ideas seriously and to assist you.
Taking what? Oh, sorry, Mark. Go. Go ahead.
Just on the point of expense, which Bron mentioned, the meeting fee now is quite high. It's been raising steadily to meet the cost of the organization. But I just wanted to mention there is a fee waiver system where you can apply for a waiver for that fee, and that goes to some folks who say, okay, well, this looks like it's a deserving person, let's give them. So if it's a financial issue for you to participate in the IETF, be aware of that.
Another thing we're trying to work on is that having your name on a published RFC is quite valuable career-wise. And we're trying to look at other ways to give people value without having to just try and get their name on an RFC, to recognize contribution to the IETF, because that is very important for someone in early stages of their career who is involved in the IETF, to get some recognition of it, something that they can show to new potential employers to say that they're worth hiring for their contacts in IETF and for their abilities.
Well, that is a fantastic segue for the next question. So the next question is, what, if any, opportunities exist for novices to contribute to the work of the IETF? And even if they don't have any technical background, is there a space for them? I'm happy for Bron to
Well,
start.
technical background is a tricky one there. There is a base level of knowledge that's really required to be useful in technical fields. There's things you can do, but if you don't understand the technical underpinnings, it is going to be very challenging to be taken seriously by a technical group. And there's you can say that's not not nice necessarily, but it's also really important. We're operating on we are maintaining an engineering giant piece of work in some ways. The internet's a really complex system. There are lots of ways in which you can break it pretty horribly if you don't think through the edge cases. So it is an engineering discipline in some ways. And I know IT and engineering kind of has a bad name because we're not serious like bridge builders in some ways, but in other ways we are kind of building a bridge here. And so you need to show up with enough of the base knowledge that you can tell if a span needs to have a support under it so it doesn't just collapse. And if you come in saying we should just take that out because it looks ugly, people aren't going to listen to you because that's not how the world works. Yes. and we have to actually work within reality and the constraints of physics at the end of it. And if you don't understand those, then it's going to be really hard to contribute meaningfully. So that one's, I'd say, a technical background is necessary. That said,
it's almost vital.
Different technical requirements, and it's not that you have to know everything. You have to have the humility to know what you don't know. Yes. The worst challenges we've had are people showing up to the IETF with very strong opinions backed by nothing real, and they are a real challenge.
Yeah, I'd say it a little bit differently. I think I showed up in standards work without what many would consider to be a technical background, but I wanted to do it. I had a strong desire to get up to speed and probably the patience to keep on plugging at it, even despite evidence that it probably wasn't for me. I don't have a degree in computer science or a related field. I've just been doing it long enough, and I have enough context from participating in this now for oh dear, more than 20 years, that I can add value in certain areas. But I also know my limits. There are areas where I have almost no background, although I've sucked up a lot by osmosis. So if there's a graduate or a student who really has a desire to operate at this level and understanding what that means, I'd say go for it. Come in, ask for issues that they can help rewrite specification text, get involved in discussions, ask questions, get to know people. Just realize it's going to be a very long-term effort, yes. and you have to be in it for that long term. You can't get value out of it in a week or even a month or two. And as Bron says, going into it with humility is, I think, really key.
So we have a follow-up question to the previous one. So one of our participants said, I'm considering attending for my first time. If I did, what would you recommend for a new person? For example, following a stream or working group only, get a mate or a buddy to follow around. This person's interest is in observing and learning how the IETF works and the multi-stakeholder model and the consents over consensus, rather than specifically wanting to contribute to those technical standards. So more the operational workings of it. What would be the best model, Mark?
There's a group of us who talk a lot about that sort of thing. And I think that there's a greater community of people who talk about things like multi-stakeholderism and its place in the world in terms of governance mechanisms. I think the IETF provides, mechanisms to onboard new people. There's meetups. There's a dinner for newcomers. There's a meetup, I think, on the Sunday. They have a buddy system where they assign you someone to check in throughout the week and give you guidance about what you should do and how you should approach the meetings. Those mechanisms are all tilted towards technical participation, but I think they're still valuable for people who have not experienced the IETF before. But if you're interested in kind of the more administrative meta issues there are certainly some folks you can talk to, and the best way is to identify the groups talking about them. Those policy level discussions, we tend to call them, in places like Gen Dispatch is one group. and there's a couple of other mailing lists, and then get involved in those discussions, probably before the IETF meeting. If you send a few exploratory emails and just say, identify those lists and say, hi, I'm a new participant. I'm interested in these things. Is anybody willing to talk to me early in the week so I can get an idea of where to go? You'll probably get some responses. And if you're not sure where to send that, I think that there are some contacts you can make as a newcomer as part of the sign-up process, or even just the participants list for the meeting. And you can go and say, I'm interested in this, and you'll inevitably get a response. Maybe wait for 2 or 3 responses, because you'll get different opinions, which is always interesting in the IETF. But yeah.
Good answer.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brian.
I have had people at different levels completely outside my area be buddied up with me, and one of the real values is being able to introduce them to the right people. So even though I might know nothing about their area, I'll take them over to the area director or to the chair of one of the working groups that they're interested in, introduce them, because I know most of the working group chairs through having sat in rooms with them every IETF for the last many years as we do our chair workshops. So it's a good opportunity in that way. The other thing I would probably add to what Mark said about the mailing lists, yes, post them, but also read some of the stuff that's already been said. You'll both get a feel for some of the people who are involved, and also a feel for how the work is done in that working group. One of the best things you can do is try and understand the culture before diving in, and trying to make your mark on it. There's a lot that you can absorb first, and trying to fit the existing culture rather than go in and demand that it fit to you.
That reminds me, I think one thing to point out is that the IETF, although not terribly diverse on certain axes, has a lot of diversity of opinion, and you will have come across people who vehemently suggest that things are this way. Don't take everything you hear at face value. There are a diversity of opinions, and it's important to realize that no single person represents the entire community. It really is a community, and the only things that represent community consensus are those RFCs. So if it's not written down in one of those, question it. And if it is written down in one of those, question it, but maybe not as much.
Yeah. Question at the bar.
Yeah, a little bit lackluster there. Okay, I'm just conscious of time. We've got 12 minutes left. So I have a few more questions that I'd like to put out to my panelist. What advice would you give someone who is interested in getting involved in the IETF? I know we talked about reading, but is there anything else, is there any specific pathways that they need to explore?
I'd start by thinking about which part of the IETF you're interested in, because the IETF is very large, and approaching from a specific area will probably help quite a lot, particularly if it's something that you yourself use or are interested in. That would be the way to get started, and then try and come along and sign up for the buddy system, which I've forgotten the name of it. I'm at a different conference next week that calls it guides, but I think it's something different at IETF, and I just can't remember what it is. But yeah, sign up to have someone show you around, come to all the newcomer meet and greet things, to meet working group chairs, meet other new people, and just soak it up. The fact that it's in Australia for the first time in quite a while, and Brisbane's lovely. The area around I was at the convention centre just a month ago for another conference. It's lovely there. So come along, check it out.
So
it's almost like a sponge. Just go and absorb as much as you can.
Yeah, very much so.
Yes.
If you go to the IETF website and you click on the page, the link for the Brisbane meeting, there's a link on that page, and it's called Information for New Participants. And that's got all the different resources and kind of there's a video you can watch to get an introduction, and then what the events are that are tailored to new participants. And there's actually even more than I realized. There's a tutorial, a quick connections where you can meet lots of people, a dinner, a happy hour, which I think is new. And then there's
the newcomers happy hour has been going on for a while.
Has it? I just oblivious.
I normally go along.
Okay. I didn't realize you could.
Meet new people.
And then there's the guides program, which is what you were referring to. And that's I think probably one of the more valuable things, and a list of tips as well.
I know that. Thank you for sharing that. That's a really valuable resource there. So my last question to my audience participants is, what can we actually expect if we have to participate in the IETF 119 or 119 in Brisbane next year, except for multiple streams of information being shared?
Well, so the agenda for the meeting isn't set until a relatively small number of weeks before the meeting. It's all kind of just in time. They get requests from all the different working groups, and what's going to be happening in the different working groups. I mean, some of them will be able to predict that long ahead of time because they have long running efforts that they're working on. Other times things come up during the meeting, literally during the week, that are accommodated at the very last minute in some session or other. And so what happens is in some ways entirely predictable, and in other ways is anybody's guess. I think, progress will be made on documents through this laborious process that we have. Things will move forward. There may be something happening in the greater world that affects the meeting where we have to change our discussions. Most memorably for me, we were meeting in Berlin just a few weeks after the Snowden revelations in 2013, and that changed the character of that meeting quite dramatically. We had lots of discussions that were very much about how do we protect the internet from what we already perceived as an attack, and that eventuated in a lot of changes to the internet. So it just depends. It's really hard to predict what will happen, and that's, I think, part of what makes it exciting.
Having said that, I can give you a rough shape of what a day looks like. Sessions are 1.5 or 2 hours long. They are generally pretty much working sessions. So they will have 1 or 2 chairs sitting up the front of the room, a bunch of people sitting in the room, 2 big screens, one of which is presenting slides and one of which is presenting a queue of remote participants. There will be people attending via video call. We use a technology called Meet Echo, which allows quite a lot of people to be participating, basically just listening to audio, but they can raise their hand and enter a queue of people to speak, at which point they can switch on video or not and speak via audio into the room. There'll be a text chat that's running concurrently with that people can comment in there and also ask questions, and somebody in the room will be monitoring that so that they can raise questions that have come in purely via text. So that's kind of what a working session looks like. In that session, there will be probably multiple people presenting about documents that they're currently working on or new ideas they're bringing to the working group. And they will generally be bringing a discussion about the document. So there'll be a published list of which documents the working group's currently discussing, and the authors will present the questions they have for the group, and the group will actually work through those questions in the room. So most of those sessions will be working sessions. And so each day will start sometime around 9:30 generally and finish 5:30, 6, with a couple of breaks during the day. On the Wednesday, generally, there's a plenary session in the evening where the IETF leadership, if there's a leadership change, they will present that there, where everyone who wants to, not the entire IETF, but a lot of people will come along and can ask questions of the leadership group in that session. Fridays have traditionally finished early, but I think that's filling up now to the point that it might be 5 really solid days of work. And each of those, there will be up to 8 concurrent sessions running. So you will be in the meeting venue we're in, there will be 8+ different rooms. Each room will have a QR code that you can scan on your phone, or you can join the meeting from your computer now, and that's used to track attendance. If you speak in an IETF meeting, you need to have logged your attendance and you agree to something called the note well. And this is a set of basically the rules for engagement at the IETF, which particularly have rules around IPR. If you're aware of any patents that apply to the work that's happening, and you speak to it, you have to declare your knowledge of them, so that you can't submarine stuff that you know is patented into a standard. So if you're influencing the development, then you need to make the IETF aware. It doesn't mean that you have to license it, just means that the IETF has to be aware that this work has influenced the standard, and that will go into the, or influence discussion that will go into the decision making of whether to standardize it or not. It doesn't necessarily mean that it won't be standardized, but it will be a consideration. If we are standardizing something that doesn't have licensing on reasonable terms, then the IETF will be much less willing to make that part of a standard.
Yes.
So there'll be rules around that, and the attendance. If you want to speak, generally the microphone queue will be opened to allow people to speak, and anyone at that point can raise their hand and request to be added to the queue. It used to be that you would stand in line. These days it's done electronically, so the queue is handled electronically, but you still stand up at a microphone to speak in front of the room. People are very friendly to new people in that context. There's no difficulty in getting your opportunity to speak inside a session. The only difficulty, of course, is there are time constraints. So the chairs will at some point close the microphone line if discussion's going too long on one particular piece and there's more of the agenda to get through. We do try and stick to times, at least roughly, because often there'll be multiple people trying to present work in a single working group, and they all need to have their opportunity. You don't want to spend all the time on the first session.
Well, it sounds like it's very structured. Thank you. We have...
Sorry, just one very quickly. You reminded me there's one more thing people should be aware of. The weekend before the IETF meeting, there's a hackathon. And so that's people working on projects, writing code to implement IETF standards. That's actually gotten to be quite big and quite successful. And it's a great way to meet people and get context and build relationships. So if you do have a project or you can see in the hackathon, there will be a wiki, there's a project you're interested in, I'd highly recommend that.
Gosh, it sounds like a very full agenda.
Free to attend.
Yes, it's a very full agenda.
It is free to attend the hackathon, and there's no requirement that you come to the IETF as well. You can do one or both.
Yeah.
Right. If you've done it properly, it's an exhausting week.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it. So we have one more question from the audience. Can you share any examples of IETF standards that have a significant impact on the internet industry? Right.
Well, Mark would know more of these than I have.
Okay, Mark.
But I mean, the IMAP standard, which is from email, has had a massive influence on the industry in that area.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that just because something becomes an RFC, an internet standard, doesn't mean that it automatically is adopted or that it's how the internet works. That requires it to actually be implemented. So it's not that the IETF has some form of control. It's just a mark of a certain level of review and consensus. And so, there are plenty of RFCs that never really see the light of day in that way. But having said that, when they succeed well. So, for example, I was the chair of the Quick Working Group, which is kind of the follow-on to TCP. It's a new transport layer protocol built on UDP, and it makes the web faster. It makes applications that use quick faster like HTTP. It makes them more reliable. And so we especially see that in parts of the world where there is not great connectivity, whether that's out in the bush in Australia or in Africa or India or in rural America, and that makes a difference in people's lives. Likewise, a lot of the security and standards have significant impacts on people's privacy. So they're making impacts on people's lives. On the internet industry, well, I think there's a symbiotic relationship there. The internet industry wouldn't exist without the internet, and the internet doesn't exist if we can't agree how to talk to each other, which comes back to the beginning. And so we need standards to make sure that the internet continues to operate as it does.
Would you like to add anything, Brian?
No, that pretty much covered it.
Good to know.
We wrapped it up very well.
Yes,
we did. Good agenda management.
We did. As we went, we actually answered all the questions that were in the chat, so we don't have any more questions. In one sentence, can you tell us what is the most value-add thing that you can take away from the IETF, Brian?
Oh, that's a mean question. I don't have an
answer
for that. No, what's the most valuable thing you can take away from the IETF? For me, it's been the relationships I've built with people there, and having so many smart people I can call on if I'm struggling with something. I can throw questions about how something works, and I will know people who were right there and understand it very deeply.
That's a great answer. Mark.
I think that's exactly it. For better or worse, have built a career on knowing what's happening there, knowing the right people to talk to. There are so many things I don't know, but I know, well, I can talk to that guy over at Apple, or I can talk to that woman over at Microsoft, or whatever, and get a really good view of what's happening in different parts of the internet and the different companies and other entities who participate in it. And that's incredibly valuable and rewarding too. There are a lot of really great people who participate in this, and I feel really privileged to know some of them, including that guy right over there.
Right over
I'm
there.
on the other side of your screen.
Thank you, Zim.
So we barely ever see each other in Melbourne. It's ridiculous. We run into each other more often.
We live about what, 3K apart or something now?
Yeah, barely that.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Okay, so we have reached the end of our session today. So we need to wrap this up here. Thank you all for making the time to actually attend today's webinar. And I'd like to say a huge thank you to both Mark and Bron for your interest, your insightful discussion, the time you've taken. I know Bron is joining us from the other side of the continent. So thank you very, very much for all the interesting facts and stories that you've shared with us. I'm going to ask Kylie to go over to the... Yeah, thank you very much, Kylie. As always, if you're not currently a .au member, I strongly encourage you to join the .au membership. It is a complimentary membership, and as well as significantly supporting our independent administration for .au, it connects you to a range of benefits and services. And as you can see with this webinar, with fantastic speakers that share their knowledge and experience with us. As always, if anybody has any questions about our .au membership or suggestions for future events, please reach out to us at membership@auda.org.au. I just want to quickly also mention all the upcoming events, the in-person events that we have. So next week, we have an in-person event on Wednesday, the 11th of October in Adelaide, if all goes well weather-wise. This will be a networking event featuring a panel discussion on a very relevant topic, talking about the evolution of innovation, opportunities and challenges in the digital age. This event will be held in partnership with the Women in Innovation in Adelaide and will be held at the Stone and Chalk Startup Hub in Adelaide. If you are able to join us, please register via the events page on our website. We will also have an in-person event coming up in Perth and in Canberra over the next several weeks, which we will share on the website with you and in our newsletter coming out. Lastly, we'll also be hosting 2 separate webinars during October, and the details of these will be on the page on our members page shortly. Also, all the updates of all events and everything that is coming up will be in our newsletter as mentioned. I would just like to say thank you again, gentlemen. As I said, insightful conversation, lots of knowledge being shared, very inclusive, reiterating that we all have to contribute to make a change. I really appreciate it. On that note, thank you everybody for joining us, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, Steph.
Thanks.